Known by his radio name, Johnny Rabbit, though. Ron has been a local radio personality in St. Louis for over 6 decades, a member of multiple halls of fame, which maybe you'll learn about today, and even has his namesake on a Ted Drewes frozen custard. So that's like the pinnacle of St. Louis celebrity right there. So thanks again for coming, and please join me in welcoming Ron to the podium.
Make it official, of course. Ah, there it is. Dan Stevens, Dan from the Ozark Theater, home of the Webster Groves concerts that go on there. And there's one about Louis Armstrong coming up. That if you've not seen that, there are some flyers out at the table. Well, welcome to this first listing of the initial inductees for the St. Louis History Hall of Fame. We've got a Hall of Fame for the Cardinals, for photography, for soccer, for the Muni, the media, the chess. It just goes on and on. Of course, the best known and most visible of all, the St. Louis Walk of Fame on the Delmar Loop. So you're in at the very beginning in the St. Louis History Hall of Fame, and there are ballots outside on the table. Please pick one up and leave it here if you can. You can put your name, address, phone number on it if you want. You don't have to. And it'll explain how you can vote. And everything is always confidential, as Joe does with Joe Edwards with his Walk of Fame. Our music, of course, by Dan Stevens. Guys, if you want to find out more about the inductees, you can always go to the History Museum Library and Research Center on Skinker, which is open to the public. Later, Chris Nofziger will have a presentation regarding a famous beer baron who is entering the Hall of Fame today. We'll have a panel discussion with Tom Dunn of Gateway Riverboat Cruises, Robert Vogel, Director of Business and Relationship Development of Ittner Architects, Frank Trampy of the National Building Arts Foundation, and photographer and humanist Susie Gorman. History Hall of Fame concept kind of started back at the History Museum in 1985 with the media archive and collections, and it's taken a lot of time to really get to where we are today as far as naming people. And in life, as Mary Angelou once said, in life you will likely encounter many defeats, but you must not be defeated. In fact, it may be good to encounter defeat so you can know who you are and you can rise from them. We're presenting, sort of in chronological order today, our inductees, of which there are really quite a few. You know, over 25 people, a lot of people ask me who was involved with this, and again, all confidential. 25 people, a few more than that, related to the study of St. Louis history, were involved in the selection of our Hall of Fame members. Unfortunately, I know many of you, maybe all of you today, will be deeply disappointed that one of your all-time favorite St. Louis boosters did not make the list, and that's Stan Kroenke. He's a lovely man. Pierre Laclede selected the site for St. Louis and sent this guy, young Auguste Chouteau, and 30 men here to start the settlement right around February 15th in 1764. Chouteau, at the age of 28, was a prominent businessman, and when Laclede died in 1778, Chouteau acquired his house, his grounds, and the mill tract that ran all the way to 39th Street. Chouteau created our first city subdivision. He was a judge, a trustee of the city, a colonel in the militia, a bank president. In those days before photography, silhouettes were kind of an in thing, and this is one depicting him when he was a colonel in the militia. He died in 1829, entombed at Calvary Cemetery. After his death, it was said that his life has been a model of virtues, civic and social. Information on some of these, including this, entries are from the St. Louis Story, a book by McCune Gill, and a quote by an early historian that's in Joe Edwards' book, The St. Louis Walk of Fame, 140 Great St. Louisans, is that Laclede founded and Auguste Chouteau built St. Louis. That's a Stuart Gilbert painting of Meriwether Lewis. And then we're going to see William Clark in a minute. They entered the Hall of Fame together, because you always think about Lewis and Clark together, always intertwined. Both had become successful landowners and public officials here, but it was their heritage of being from Virginia that connected them to President Thomas Jefferson, who had dreams of Western exploration. And after getting a small appropriation from Congress, he got Lewis and Clark to lead what would always be known as their famed expedition to the West. It started and ended here. In 1809, on a trip to Washington, at that time the mentally troubled Lewis either committed suicide or was murdered. His gravesite has never officially been found. There is a marker there, but they don't know if he's really buried near that site. Clark, though, died of natural causes in 38. He's buried at Bellefontaine Cemetery. And there's William Clark standing very regally there. That's our first mayor, Dr. William Carr Lane. He came from Philadelphia, took office in 1823, was once governor of the New Mexico Territory, a professor at our first medical school, had a lot of real estate holdings, and even a farm that ran along Choteau from Vandeventer to Kings Highway. And he was responsible for naming many of our streets in the manner of those in Philadelphia by using numerically named streets from east to west and tree names from north to south. He once stated, "The progressive rise of our city of St. Louis is certain." Well, we go to the Fields. This painting is of Roswell Field. We'll see Eugene Field in a moment in an engraving and a photo of their house, which was taken by famed photographer Paul Piaget. The Fields and the house are combined as one inductee into the History Hall of Fame. Now, you can get more details on all of this at the new Field House Museum. Dennis Taki, a noted architect who is with us today, is responsible for that new facility. It's in the 600 block of South Broadway, a block south of Busch Stadium. Roswell Field, noted local attorney, is remembered for representing slaves Dred and Harriet Scott in their quest for freedom. Eugene, Roswell's son, is noted for his journalistic fame, especially for his children's verses such as Little Boy Blue. Samuel Mark Twain Clemens dedicated the Field House, which would be to the right in this picture, in Eugene's honor in 1902. It's on property once owned by Choteau that later would become Walsh's Row. Some of the information is in the book titled St. Louis Then and Now by Elizabeth McNulty and Maureen Cavanaugh. That's Susan Blow, and while studying in Germany, she became interested in the early childhood learning concepts of educator Friedrich Froebel, who in turn was a follower of Johann Heinrich Pestalozzi. In 1873, Susan Blow established the first publicly funded kindergarten in America at the DePere School on Michigan Avenue, which now houses the Carondelet Historical Society, in which there is an authentic replica of her first kindergarten, actually in its original room. At 13, when this man, James B. Eads, came to town from Indiana with his family, he was so poor to make money he actually sold apples in street corners. He became an assistant clerk on a steamboat, and at 22 he started a company to salvage wrecked steamboats. At the start of the Civil War, he convinced officials in Washington he could build ironclad river warships, and he got the backing to do so. In 1867, Eads turned his engineering skills into the creation of the bridge that bears his name. Our image shows the bridge in the early stages of construction in August of 73, would open in July 4th the next year. That's Robert Campbell, came to St. Louis from Ireland to work in the fur trading business. He did that so he could travel in the open territory of the West to improve his health, and it did. After 12 years, he opened a large outfitting business. He assisted the government in expeditions in the Mexican War, worked a lot as a representative with Indian consuls, became a bank president and owner of the original Southern Hotel. Then he and his wife, Virginia, bought the house at 20 Lucas Place, one of the most prestigious streets of the day. Now, that house remains the same. If you've not been in there, you've got to go sometime, because it's the way it was in the 19th century. A fascinating story about that, and it really has to do with the last two Campbell sons who lived there as recluses, with the last one, Hazlitt, who was not of sound mind, dying in 1938. This snowy picture of the house is from 39, looks about the same today. Many civic-minded St. Louisans and firms such as Stixpair and Fuller got control of the house and its treasured contents, and it remains a relic of time gone by. A beautiful book called The Gilded Table by Suzanne Corbett is about the house. It's available at the museum gift shop here. And when we do a program on restaurants, dining, beer, wine, and soda, that's on Tuesday, August 22nd. She will be one of our presenters. This is an 1876 picture of Kate Chopin in a riding habit. Kate, or Kathleen, was a talented writer, born in St. Louis. She moved to New Orleans, where she married Oscar Chopin. When he passed away, Kate, who was a mother, bought a house here at 3317 Morgan Street, now Del Mar, and started really writing. She wrote over 100 short stories. Some appeared in the publication Reedy's Mirror. Her most important work was the 1899 novel, The Awakening, that told the story of a cheating wife and her unorthodox views of femininity and motherhood. It didn't get good reviews, but it sold like crazy. Kate moved to 4232 McPherson, which is now on the National Register of Historic Places. She died of a cerebral hemorrhage as she was walking home from the World's Fair. Some of this information is in a new book called Renaissance, A History of the Central West End by Candace O'Connor. And Kate, along with several of the others that we're mentioning, has a star on that famous St. Louis Walk of Fame. At first, it looks like Shaw's Garden, but it's Tower Grove Park. In 1872, the park came into existence after Henry Shaw donated this portion of his estate to the city to help fulfill his endeavor of creating what he called an ornamental pleasure ground. Shaw's arrangement was that he'd give St. Louis 300 acres of his land for the park, but the city would always need to pay for improvements and maintenance, and that control of the park would be in the hands of a board of commissioners first appointed by him and following his death by the Missouri Botanical Garden. You can learn more about the park and the neighborhood from a book called Tower Grove by Mark Abbott. I'm happy to have done a foreword for that book. And it'll tell you what's in Tower Grove Park today, as well as another document. It's a spiral-bound book, only sells for $10, and if you're interested in parks, it's a must. It's called Discovering Public Parks in St. Louis, Missouri. It's by Nancy Ellen Carver. Now, this photo, taken from the old entrance of the Missouri Botanical Garden at Tower Grove Avenue at the west end of Flora Place, shows the lily ponds and in the distance the main pound house. And that was replaced by the Climatron 57 years ago. Henry's having a little snooze here. In 1819, a year after he left England for Canada with his father, and after a trip to New Orleans, Henry Shaw arrived by steamboat with a stock of cutlery from his uncle. He opened a small store where he lived on the second floor of a building in Maine just north of Market. Then he took a trip back to England. He saw some wonderful floral gardens near a palace in Sheffield, where he was from. Decided to come back to St. Louis and create even a finer garden by his country home called Tower Grove. Now, our photo of Shaw is from 1885, and it shows him posing for sculptor Ferdinand von Miller for his sarcophagus, which is displayed in the mausoleum in Shaw's garden. An 1883 steel engraving of Robert Barnes, who was a clerk in several wholesale houses and then entered business for himself, ultimately owning a large wholesale grocery firm. He'd become a director of the Bank of the State of Missouri, later that bank's president. He owned a lot of land, especially in Ladue. He died and willed his entire estate to the founding of Barnes Hospital, which was completed at that point in 1915. The location was proposed by the executors of Barnes Estate and Washington University's president, Robert Brookings, as it would be adjacent to WashU School of Medicine. Here's the complex, the Barnes Hospital complex, as it appeared in the mid-1940s. A few of the buildings are still there, but a lot more have been added. Near the start of the Civil War, William Tecumseh Sherman came to St. Louis, and he was president of the St. Louis Railroad, which was a streetcar company. Sounds like Joe Edwards. Wait a minute. Following his retirement from the Army of the Republic, then General Sherman, who was called Billy by his troops, came back to St. Louis, where he became representative for San Francisco and New York at the local banking institution of J.H. Lucas and Company. He lived here in a house that was given him by a committee at 912 Garrison Avenue. It no longer exists. This is a steel engraving of the likeness of St. Louis-born Rolla Wells, the son of Erastus Wells, a politician who was involved in several transportation companies and the Laclede Gas Line Company. Rolla, also known as Rollo, was the mayor of St. Louis at the time of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. During his tenure, the installation of the process of clarifying the water used in St. Louis was completed. He was elected for a second term in 1912 as an officer of the Democratic National Convention from 1914 to 16. He was governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. The city of Wellston is named for his family. In 1933, Rolla wrote a very interesting book of memoirs called Episodes of My Life. At the time of his death, at 88 in 1944, he lived in number 25 Westmoreland Place. This is the Ragtime King, Scott Joplin. From the cover of the 1904 sheet music for the Cascades, which he wrote in honor of the Cascades at our World's Fair. Joplin was born in Texas. He died at the age of 48 in New York and was the most famous ragtime pianist. He also composed two operas, A Guest of Honor and Tremonisha, and was a Pulitzer Prize winner. He moved here from Sedalia in 1901 to be near his music publisher, John Stark, but then Joplin left for New York in 1907. He lived here at this house, which is pictured at what was Morgan Street, 2658 Elmore. It's a state historic site today, and you can visit it. In a short period of time after arriving in St. Louis, Michigan, to be a purchasing agent for the International and Great Northern Railroad, this gentleman, William Bixby, went to work for the Missouri Car and Foundry Company. In 1899, he directed the merger of that company with another firm to create the enormously successful American Car and Foundry Company, and he was quite the philanthropist, supporting institutions such as the Mercantile Library, History Museum, Art Museum. He was a charter member of the American Red Cross, also a member of the board of Washington University, where Bixby Hall is named for him, and upstairs we have Bixby's Restaurant. Bixby also spent a few bucks on himself. This is a 1904 photo of the billiard room at his mansion called Bixby Farm. That's where the Chase Park Plaza is today. This photo dates to 1905, and Bixby died in 1931. This is John Joseph Glennon. In 1904, he was Archbishop of the St. Louis Diocese from 1903 until he died in 1946 when he was elevated to Cardinal. During his tenure, 7 Catholic high schools opened, 2 seminaries, several parishes, and the new cathedral, and his name lives on with Cardinal Glennon Hospital. Speaking of the new cathedral, one of the great buildings of America, here it is, and you can learn a lot about history through mosaics, such as the life of the good King St. Louis, our city's patron saint. The cathedral, designed by the firm of Barnett, Hayes, and Barnett, started construction in 1907 and it opened in 1914. In the center is an interesting traffic light right in the middle of the street. Our picture dates to 1925. You can find more information about this in a lot of other places in the book, A Guide to the Architecture of St. Louis by George McHugh. What a street this was. Arguably the greatest private place in the history of our city, Vandeventer Place. A testament to the good life of the late 19th century. And it was still one of the finest streets in the area at the time of the World's Fair. The street started in 1849, bordered by Grand, Vandeventer, Bell, and Enright. It was bulldozed away and replaced first in 47 in the eastern half by Veterans Hospital. The western half became site of the Juvenile Detention Center. You can find more about Vandeventer Place on St. Louis Patina, a website maintained by one of our guests today, Chris Nofziger. And part of that street still exists. It's here in Forest Park. It's the Louis Mulligard East Gate. He designed the East Gate of Vandeventer Place. It's just slightly northeast of the Jewel Box. And there's a statue in the Parkway of Shaw Place that likely was moved there from Vandeventer Place, but that's not 100% certain. Well, you're hearing a lot about the work of famed architect William B. Ittner today. Later on, 2 members of our panel will talk more about it, but suffice to say that Ittner, who appears in this wood engraving, was president of the St. Louis chapter of the American Institute of Architects in 1893 to 95, president of the Architectural League of America in 1903 and 4, and created a new style of school building designs. He also built one of our city's great skyscrapers, which is going to turn 90 in 2 years. He was on the St. Louis Plaza Development Commission at the time of his death, and he's also been honored with a star on the St. Louis Walk of Fame. Adolphus Busch is going to be an inductee today to the St. Louis History Hall of Fame. What we see here is an 1880 wood engraving of the then very small Anheuser-Busch brewery under Conrad that was used as a souvenir card. Now from March 28, 1919, all bundled up to protect them from the cold, we have Adolphus and Lily Busch. Here in 1913, it's the Warenhof at the Busch Estate on Gravois, now part of Grant's Farm, which opened to the public in 1954. Chris Nofziger has prepared a special presentation on Adolphus and the gang, so we'll hear from him a little later. We all know that building, one of St. Louis's most identifiable landmarks, Beeville Mill, built 100 years ago. The goal of the owner, Anheuser-Busch, was to create this and other locations as family-themed restaurants to replace the typical saloons of the day. Thereby, it hoped to ward off the growing specter of prohibition. The name Bevo was a non-alcoholic near beer produced by A.B. Mill was first used by the Busch family and then opened to the public, and the manager at that time lived in the Mill apartment. There's still an apartment there, not in repair at this time, but they hope to make it a bed and breakfast. Later on, Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Schneithorst lived there in the 40s and 50s when they operated Bevo Mill. For most people, the Railway Exchange Building is best remembered as the famous bar building. Fills the entire square block of Olive Locust 7th and 6th. It was erected in 1913. It's a steel-framed 21-story white terracotta covered structure. Not just the largest building in St. Louis, but once had the distinction of being the largest in the world. Our photos from 1913, we'll hear more about this from panelist Frank Traffy, who was involved with the Railway Exchange a little later on. Here in military attire, we see noted St. Louis aviation pioneer Albert Bond Lambert. He was head of the Chamber of Commerce Committee on Aeronautics, which was one of the entities that made that famous flight of Charles Lindbergh possible. As a world-class golfer, Lambert competed in the 1900 Summer Olympics and the 1904 Olympics. He became president of the family business, Lambert Pharmaceutical Company, makers of Listerine. And of course, his name is known around the world for our Lambert Airport. A good website for information on Lambert is MissouriLegends.com. The Muni, now in its 99th season, they still live up to that great old slogan of alone in its greatness. This is a very early look toward the stage. There's a water fountain, as you can see to the right in the foreground. If you're thirsty, get a bottle of water today at the Muni. It only cost you $5.50. Where's that water fountain? You'll find a good short history of the Municipal Opera actually in every show program at the theater. Yeah, Mary Wicks described the Muni as being as close to heaven as some of us will ever get. And she's on the Walk of Fame and also the Muni Hall of Fame, and that's documented in the pergola all around the sides of the Muni. You can see many of the stars that have been honored. And here's Joe. Here's Joseph Pulitzer as he appeared in 1875. Pulitzer was a reporter for the German language newspaper, the Westlich Post. In 1878, he became publisher of the merged Post and Dispatch newspapers. His philosophy was to publish sensational news to build a large circulation, which would result in selling advertising, thereby making a lot of money. At the time of his retirement in 1907, he created the paper's platform, which is printed in every issue of the Post. This 1920 picture is of the Post building when it was at the northeast corner of 12th and Olive. The place looks a lot the same today after the removal of a 1964 modernistic metal facade, a really hideous facade that covered it. It's the current owner did that. Meade Summers III brought it back almost to the original look. The only thing missing is the balustrade above the 8th floor. The only cartoon or animal being inducted into this class of the St. Louis History Hall of Fame is the Post-Dispatch Weatherbird. The Post-Weatherbird is lovingly cared for by Dan Martin. Since February 11th, 1901, our friendly bird has graced every front page of the Post. It was created by Harry Martin and is so popular that one time St. Louis-based Peter Shoe Company created a brand of shoes called Weatherbird shoes. This image from 1990 shows a Cytex operator adding color to a Weatherbird cartoon. Seems to me that there might be a Weatherbird. Is there a Weatherbird? No, there's a Weatherbird right over here. There's Dan Martin, the Weatherbird.
Ron, I need for you to ask me a question.
Yes,
This is
sir.
a question.
All right.
How is the state of health of the Weatherbird?
How is the state of health of the Weatherbird?
Sketchy, really sketchy. Actually, the Weatherbird's going strong after 116 years, and it's interesting that go right after Joseph Pulitzer, who certainly knew about the Weatherbird because he retired in 1907. The bird started in 01. But his son, Joseph Pulitzer II, really took to the Weatherbird. All the company and private airplanes Pulitzer's had were all named Weatherbird II. And Joseph Pulitzer II, on his desk every day, there was a pewter Weatherbird in the newsroom. And so on behalf of the Post-Dispatch, Ron, I want to give you a Weatherbird plush doll. Weatherbird and a much-coveted Weatherbird bobblehead.
Great. This is terrific. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Very much, Dan. Well, we'll watch for that Weatherbird tomorrow. Thank you. That was a nice visit. I appreciate it. As we continue in our basically chronological listing of St. Louis History's Hall of Fame, we come to Charles Slim Lindbergh, who we see standing next to humorist Will Rogers by a Ford Tri-Motor 12-passenger airliner. This was in 1927, a big year for Lindbergh. After Lucky Lindy said so long to his backers here, they were known as the Spirit of St. Louis organization, He was off to New York and to his famous flight of May 20th and 21st to 27th in the Spirit of St. Louis, and a replica of the Spirit of St. Louis. You can see it in the Great Hall upstairs. That is, again, a replica, but that plane was used in the 1957 James Stewart movie, The Spirit of St. Louis. For more on Lindbergh and his famed flight to France, I suggest Diane Rademacher's book called Famous Firsts of St. Louis. Let's go to Midtown. There are officially 79 neighborhoods in St. Louis. Midtown is the first to be inducted in our History Hall of Fame. Here we have a picture looking south on Grand from Del Mar. It was rush hour, 5:10 in the afternoon to be exact, July 27th, 1925. Today, this section of Midtown is called Grand Center. Over the years, Midtown had 9 theaters, 8 high-rise office buildings, and as the St. Louis Symphony, there were 6 major churches, a major university, a private law school, several streets with large homes and mansions, 9 fraternal organizations, 3 major hotels, 4 radio stations, a TV station, hundreds of offices, retailers, and dining establishments. In 1878, the late historian Norbury Wayman wrote detailed histories of Midtown and 26 other neighborhoods.